Good evening to everyone who's joined us. Welcome to another Publics at IIHS. Publics at IIHS is a platform that comprises lectures and seminars where academicians, scholars, practitioners are invited to present their work. This engagement allows for an exchange of ideas across institutions and is a significant opportunity to break traditional boundaries between the academy and public. Our speaker today is Andrew Tucker, Associate Professor and Deputy Director at the African Centre for Cities, ACC, in Cape Town, South Africa. His research is currently focused on exploring social, political, and health-related concerns affecting various sexual subjectivities across urban environments in the Global South. Today's talk, Situating Sexuality in the Urban South, Trajectories that Emerge from Sub-Saharan Africa, considers connections between sexuality research to urbanization research in the Global South. Unfortunately, Gautam Bhan will not be joining us today. In his place, I'd like to invite Neha Sami, Associate Dean, School of Environment and Sustainability at IIHS, to mediate this talk. I'd like to now hand over the webinar to Andrew and Neha.
Thank you very much, Prajna, for that very warm introduction. And hello to everyone who is zooming in. Just to note, I'm in South Africa right now, and we're currently experiencing power cuts, which they euphemistically refer to as load shedding. So my internet connection can sometimes be a little bit unstable. Hopefully it won't be too much of a problem during this talk, but if I do momentarily freeze, it's almost certainly a problem on my side, not a problem on your side. So with that in mind, I'm just going to share my screen and get going. Okay, so I hope everyone can see that. So what I'd like to do in this talk is pull together some of the thinking that's been possible as the result of the UK-funded Peak Urban program, which included the ACC and also IIHS, and was led by Professor Michael Keith at the University of Oxford. As I've written about recently, as part of a collection that includes Neha Sami, that's coming out in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, the Peak Urban program allowed the conceptual space to think about new connections in urban research that may not have been surfaced until now. So I'd therefore like to, first of all, explicitly acknowledge and thank the Peak Urban program for helping to make this talk happen. So what I want to do in this talk is to think through what possibilities exist to connect more directly urban scholarship, and specifically here, Southern urban scholarship, with existing research interests of scholars working on sexualities, specifically in relation to three key areas. And these aren't the only possible connections, but they're just the ones that I'm going to focus on today. And those are, first of all, the informal sector, and then urban politics, and then urban health. And as I'll describe in this talk, there are a range of reasons to think more about such connections. One reason is simply that Southern urbanism scholarship and scholarship on sexualities actually already share some of the same key aims. Another reason, and perhaps just as if not more importantly, is to think through what might happen if we don't connect these two fields. In particular, in the examples I'll highlight, there are a range of reasons to think through what sexualities means in the context of Southern urbanism, which go far beyond shared intellectual agendas. There are, in other words, far more instrumental reasons as to why we may want to consider sexualities in the context of Southern urbanism, which speaks to a certain degree of urgency. And that's something that I'll cover more towards the end of this talk. But lastly, just before I get going, I'd also just like to acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting here draws primarily on case studies from the sub-Saharan African region. Something that I'd be especially interested in discussing in the Q&A is how the views and arguments I'm putting forward here may actually connect to other locations, and particularly to Indian contexts. While it's a real shame that Gautam, for example, can't be here, I do know from previous conversations with him on these themes that there are in some cases some stark similarities while in other cases, very distinct differences between sub-Saharan and Indian examples when it comes both to the study of sexuality and the relationship between sexuality scholarship and urban scholarship. But first, to take a step back, there has, over the past 30 years, been a tremendous growth of sexuality scholarship, primarily first in the global north. We've seen a proliferation of studies which have started to document the lives and strategic and pragmatic strategies that communities with same-sex desire deploy to survive and thrive in oftentimes hostile environments. Within specifically the global north, we've also seen a directed link between studies of urbanization and studies of sexuality. Perhaps most famously, the seminal work of the sociologist Manuel Castells explored the ways in which gay men in San Francisco, through processes of spatial agglomeration, were able not only to build socio-spatial networks and forms of solidarity, but importantly, also economic enterprises, and even more importantly, political representation on the city council. This work set out a key blueprint for many studies that followed, with disciplines such as geography, anthropology, history, and indeed sociology, to name but a few, exploring the relationships between sexuality and urban space, several of which I've put up on the screen here. This work then went on and matured to the point of considering various forms of exclusion from particular gay spaces and the deployment of new theoretical concepts such as heteronormativity, or the normalization of spaces, and particularly urban spaces, as heterosexual, which can require individuals with same-sex desire either to confront such normalization or to avoid it. And the concept of homonormativity, or the normative strategies certain groups deploy, often due to their race, class, or gendered privilege, to align with heterosexual values to the detriment of other groups with same-sex desire. Yet while this work has flourished, especially in the global north, and especially there in metropolitan centers of relative privilege, it is perhaps surprising that scholarship on the urban south has not also considered more directly questions of sexuality. This isn't to say that there isn't scholarship on sexuality in the south. Indeed, over especially say the last 10 years or so, we've witnessed an explosion of scholarship, which has started to document sexualities and sexuality-based communities across the globe, and especially in parts of Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. This work has not only called into question some of the fundamental tenets of scholarship in the global north, such as the regulation of sexualities and a one-size-fits-all idea of heteronormativity or homonormativity. It has also highlighted the particular forms of sexuality-based activism now occurring globally, which has been all the more enriched and supported by international NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Yet while there does clearly exist vibrant research interests on sexuality now globally, it does remain the case that urban scholarship in the South, and especially what we can loosely come to define as Southern urbanism, has not yet directly considered questions of sexuality. And this is surprising for a number of reasons, which are worth spelling out here. First, both Southern urbanisms and work on sexualities, especially that which is historically related to urban spaces in the global north, have a shared interest in challenging unitary ways of exploring or coming to understand urban space. Just as scholars working on Southern urbanism have cast into relief the sometimes parochial nature of urban studies, where theories that have emerged from a limited set of global north case studies struggle to engage with or speak to urban diversity in the global south, so too have sexuality scholars challenged normative assumptions regarding urban spaces as always sexualized as heterosexual. Second, both fields have also been acutely aware of the need to engage with the experiences of sometimes overlooked or under-theorized subjects, to explore how they exist as strategic and pragmatic entities in various spaces, and not simply as passive reflectors of external processes. Thirdly, And just as importantly, we're now at a point where Southern urbanism scholarship not engaging with questions of sexuality may be potentially detrimental to same-sex communities in and of the urban South. As I'll describe later in this talk, we may wish to see instrumentally how Southern urban scholarship can bring with it a number of important tools and perspectives, which can directly support the needs of same-sex groups in the urban South and directly further scholarship on sexualities in those locations. So what I want to do in this talk today then is to think through more directly how, as urban scholars, we might connect more directly to sexualities debates and interests using three interrelated examples. The first of these is the urban informal economic sector and the particular need to consider same-sex communities as part of this sector. The second is urban politics and the need to consider forms of sexuality-based political activities as a key constituent within urban politics in the urban South. And the third is health and the opportunities that exist to consider how work on especially the HIV/AIDS pandemic may connect through to broader urban health concerns. Okay, so same-sex communities and the informal sector. Well, currently, very little research has considered the relationship between sexuality and any form of economic activity in Southern cities. Instead, the most vocal and visible debates with regard to this relationship have not come from academic scholarship at all, but rather from the private sector. This is most evident in relation to work of international financial and service companies such as Accenture, Google, PwC, Deutsche Bank, and others which are listed here, who in 2015 came together under the Open for Business Coalition with the support of the Clinton Foundation, and in particular, former US President Bill Clinton. This coalition made the case that discrimination against same-sex communities across especially the global South was limiting the economic opportunities of especially cities to compete globally. Drawing heavily on the work of scholars such as Richard Florida and the idea of the creative class, the coalition's aim is to put pressure on national and city governments to repeal laws which discriminate against same-sex communities. And as Richard Branson, chairman of the Virgin Group, was quoted as saying in relation to the Open for Business Coalition, business needs to take the lead, put pressure on governments to change some of the ghastly laws that still exist. The power of a collective business voice is extraordinarily strong. So every year, the Open for Business Coalition produces a global report where it outlines which cities are indeed open for business or accepting of individuals with same-sex desire, and which in turn, so the argument goes, will help them draw on a diverse and creative talent pool, and which cities are not open for business. Now, as you can see from this slide, which is from the 2022 ratings, there's a clear geography to cities which are open for business and those which are not. Most of the cities which are partially or entirely not open for business are in the global South. Now, while Richard Florida's ideas have already been heavily critiqued, most notably with regard to work which has highlighted that simply being accepted of same-sex groups is not actually correlated with economic performance and fails to explain places such as Dubai, which are clearly not entirely open for business, but are in fact huge economic hubs. Of particular concern in relation to this talk is how the coalition's focus both ignores and potentially undermines the existence and importance of often far larger informal economies in cities in the South, and especially African cities. By focusing on the ability of cities to access and engage in global capital flows, the types of flows that are of interest to groups such as PwC and Accenture, little to no attention is paid to those same-sex communities who exist outside of the formal economy. Now, this is especially troubling in light of the potentially proportionally far larger number of individuals with same-sex desire in the informal rather than the formal sector across cities in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa. While there exists, hardly any empirical data on this point at the moment, existing evidence from educational research, scholarship does point towards this potential. This research has pointed out the existence of very severe sexuality-based discrimination in schools across sites in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this in turn clearly has the potential to mean that students who identify with a non-heteronormative identity or are suspected by their peers may drop out of school, making it far harder for them to find permanent employment in the formal sector. Now, while schooling remains a key challenge for many in the region, and schooling is only one factor that enables entry into the formal sector, we should nevertheless appreciate the additional barriers that are potentially placed on individuals with same-sex desire. To help address an imbalance of focus whereby the most vocal groups are those that promote the formal sector of southern cities and which is so far not directly engaged with potentially larger same-sex communities in the oftentimes far larger informal sector, we can turn to experiences and lessons already learned from Southern urban scholarship. In particular, we can consider work already undertaken on diverse subject positions which exist in the informal sector in southern cities, and especially cities across sub-Saharan Africa. And here work on women and especially youth may prove instructive. Here we can take a lead from work by scholars such as Tatiana Tem, which has considered the multiple intersectional challenges that face youth groups within the informal sector, such as recent work on the urban hustle. This work has highlighted how urban youth in the informal sector exist within an assemblage of everyday struggles which come to frame their ability as active agents to navigate complex structural constraints and survive economically. So too, may we wish to frame same-sex communities as existing within and performing a version of a sexuality-based urban hustle. In this instance, we may wish to consider the need to explore the diverse strategies by which same-sex individuals and communities are able to engage in various forms of economic enterprise despite what is often viewed to be persistent sexuality-based discrimination also. So far, limited work to date has highlighted an emergent range of economic enterprises within the informal sector and peri-urban environments in sub-Saharan Africa, including the development of entertainment spaces and service industries run by or targeted at individuals with same-sex desire. Quite how and quite why such activities are successful, are able to withstand pre-existing challenges associated with the informal sector and additional challenges related to sexuality-based discrimination, can help further existing urban theorists' concerns, such as that put forward by Edgar Peterser and Abdul Malik Simone, concerning the uncovering of the enabling reasons for and strategies to replicate forms of urban innovation. Equally, and thinking back to some of the earliest interests in sexuality scholarship and urban space put forward by Manuel Castells nearly 40 years ago in relation to San Francisco, we may also want to consider how there may also be a relationship between economic enterprise, the generation of sexual support networks, and possible political representation. While this isn't to suggest that Castells' approach or approaches from the North can or should be directly mapped onto experiences in the South, it is to suggest that we should be open to the possibility that economic activity in the informal sector may well have knock-on effects that can support the needs of same-sex communities. Rather than devote resources to ranking cities as to whether they are open for business or not, we may want to explore these types of research areas instead, which would potentially speak to far larger cohorts of individuals and for whom hardly any research, at least in a sub-Saharan African context, is currently being conducted. So that's the first area of scholarship that we might want to consider in terms of a link between sexualities and scholarship on the urban South. But moving on and extending the point about political representation, we might also want to more forcibly think through how sexualities can relate to work on urban politics. So perhaps the most widely known topic related to sexuality in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa has been the struggle for gay rights, often related to human rights frameworks. Reporting in popular media, some of which is shown here, has highlighted the particular struggles faced by same-sex communities and activists in countries such as Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana, to name but a few, as they attempt to repeal colonial-era laws that prohibit especially male same-sex acts and address wider structural sexuality-based discrimination from various sectors of society and the state. Now, this work is clearly important, and I'm not suggesting here, as with the case of the problematic framings of the Open for Business coalition I just mentioned, that it should be entirely reframed. Rather, I want to suggest that there are perhaps important degrees of complexity that can get lost when popular reporting and indeed academic writing remains tethered to the relationship between sexuality-based activism and the state. What appears to be missing here is the particular urban inflection to sexuality-based politics, especially in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa. After all, as scholars of Southern urbanism have long been aware, the urban is a key location where state-based and other political processes and contestations play out. And a key area of interest for urban scholars is concerned with how community opportunities at the urban scale can be directly and explicitly related to the ways in which subjects are framed by the state in political processes, and how the demarcation between what is legal and what is illegal is oftentimes arbitrary. I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Ananya Roy. Here, illegality and legality can become key markers by which urban subjects are able to relate to and engage with the state. So therefore, opportunities exist to consider to what degree and how parallels can be seen in the oftentimes arbitrary regulation of same-sex groups in urban environments. After all, while in many sub-Saharan African contexts, homosexuality remains illegal, enforcement is often arbitrary. Recently, for example, in Uganda, state persecution of LGBT socializing venues in Kampala was found by Human Rights Watch to neither be uniform in their enforcement or to follow any particular logic. Potentially clear parallels can therefore be seen between urban pre-existing scholarship on the arbitrary demarcation of illegality and legality as key markers by which some urban subjects are able to relate to and engage with the state, and the particular experiences of same-sex communities in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Here, we may want to consider the possibility of there not just simply existing parallels in experience, but also that same-sex groups may at key moments also form political solidarities with other marginalized groups who experience state sanctions in the urban environment. Evidence already suggests that same-sex community groups in sub-Saharan Africa can align closely with women's groups for particular forms of political activity. The degree to which other broad-based urban political solidarity movements include same-sex communities as a possibly relatively unacknowledged constituent remains to be explored. What seems likely, however, is that there are such forms of urban solidarities across different groups that emerge when shared interests are in place. These, however, are yet to be uncovered. Such work on potential solidarities could then also be enriched by taking a lead from other work by Edgar Peterson on urban politics and the need to consider a very wide range of ways in which urban dwellers engage with state processes, from formal protest through to the instigation of community-based development projects. Here we may wish to see similarities in the way same-sex communities and activists can respond to state actions. While not often framed in the context of urban politics or protests, NGOs and civil society groups that support same-sex communities in the region, often headquartered either in primary or secondary cities, are engaged in a wide variety of activities. These range from marches through urban environments and advocacy and lobbying the state, which are the types of activities most commonly put forward in popular discourses, to working closely with the state on certain localized community projects to shift negative perspectives, often in concert with a range of different partners. Work from beyond academia, such as the recent excellent and path-defining book by the journalist Mark Gavissa, is now starting to uncover such complex and nuanced dynamics. Academics, and urban academics in particular, are yet to catch up to him. But such explorations may prove especially important, both to further our understanding of sexuality-based politics in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa as being more directly urban in nature, and including a very wide range of activities and potential partners, and to consider how sexuality-based politics is connected to wider urban political research. So that's the second example. And the last example I want to draw on is that related to urban health. And I also want to go into a bit more detail about this one because of the connections it has to the recent article I mentioned earlier that's coming out in IIHS as part of a collection with Nihar Sami and others with regard to findings from the Peak Urban project. So to begin here, it's important to appreciate that there are clearly already significant interests from within Southern urban literature on urban health. Addressing urban public health in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa has been viewed as fundamental so that global public health targets can be met. And scholarship has also shown how this requires support for effective health governance systems, especially in contexts of rapid growth and finite resources. Furthermore, as scholars such as Claire Herrick have also already described, any effective health system also needs to appreciate the complexity in which urban spaces connect to embodied experiences and the multifaceted negotiations and decision-making undertaken by subjects. Moving beyond determinist accounts of urban environments as the primary regressive agent affecting social processes related to health, it's important to consider how urban residents are active agents that relate to, but are not solely limited by the urban environment. So we can see a wealth of scholarship in terms of Southern urbanism related to health. What's been missing, though, from an urban studies frame is how sexualities relates to urban health in the global South. Yet, in sharp contrast to this lack of engagement by urban scholars, has been very significant engagement by public health scholarship and public health funders with regard to the connections between sexuality and health in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this is most evident in the sub-Saharan African region in relation to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. As many people are aware, sub-Saharan Africa has been especially affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic, with South Africa in particular having one of the highest HIV prevalences in the world. Because of this, very significant international donor funding from groups such as the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which is the logo on the top right here, and from groups such as USAID, the logo on the top left, have been channeled into countries in sub-Saharan Africa in attempts to address the pandemic, especially in urban areas where prevalence is often highest. Now, in particular, funds have been used to try and achieve what is called 90-90-90, or more recently, actually 95-95-95. But for reasons of simplicity, let's just stick with 90-90-90. And that's the diagram on the bottom right of this slide. So what 90-90-90 means is that in any given region, 90% of HIV positive individuals know that they are HIV positive, that 90% of those have been initiated on ARV drug treatment, and that 90% of those are adherent to treatment and virally suppressed. So the logic goes, this means that HIV/AIDS can be effectively ended in the next decade, because if people are virally suppressed, they can't pass on the virus. Yet to achieve 90-90-90 targets, which are now common across the global South and the key driver behind funders such as PEPFAR, there's also an acknowledgement that certain groups are at particularly higher risk of contracting and passing on HIV compared to other groups. Risk groups are termed by public health officials as key populations, and included within them are the epidemiologically defined groups such as men who have sex with men, or MSM, along with sex workers and people who inject drugs. Now, I'll be focusing on the men who have sex with men, or MSM group here. What's important to realize here, however, is just how much money and other resources have been targeted at groups such as MSM in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in urban centers. And also, it's important to realize how little engagement this sheer quantum of resources has received from urban scholars. Now, to give just one example, every few years, PEPFAR puts out a funding call for work in particular countries. And the most recent funding call in South Africa, where funding was targeted at 2 urban centers in the country for a 5-year program, was budgeted at $15.5 million US, which at the time was converted into roughly 220 million South African rand. 220 million, that's the number that you need to keep in your head. By way of comparison, the year that that call came out, the entire South African primary healthcare budget was only 300 million. So, you know, the amounts are huge, which we're talking about here. And indeed, prior to COVID, it's worth bearing in mind that PEPFAR was the largest health intervention by one country ever undertaken in human history, having spent up until last year over 90 billion US dollars since its inception. Yet, as I previously mentioned, there's been a decided silence among urban scholars with regard to such an undertaking. Recent work, however, that I've been a part of with a colleague of mine at the African Centre for Cities, Neil R. Hassan, and as part of the Peak Urban Programme, highlighted that a lack of an urban focus, specifically on how this money is being spent, can be viewed as detrimental. So taking a lead from the work of urban health scholars such as Claire Herrick, and the need to consider the embodied experience of health subjects and the way they exist as active agents, undertaking multifaceted negotiations and forms of decision-making within wider structural urban environments and limitations. Our work here explored the disjuncture between what international funders such as PEPFAR are willing to fund and what local same-sex communities need. In particular, our work, which was focused across the townships of Cape Town, and incidentally, Cape Town was one of the earliest sites to receive PEPFAR funding for MSM. And so what we found in Cape Town may well have implications across the global South in terms of where PEPFAR subsequently put in place MSM programming. But what our research in Cape Town found was a lack of engagement by internationally funded health programs with wider structural and material issues that may inhibit the ability of groups such as MSM to engage in HIV campaigns in urban environments. In other words, a narrow focus on HIV testing and treatment, which frames the remit of these programs, ignores the wider social and socio-economic marginalization challenges many MSM face in often peri-urban and informal settlements, where the need to remain HIV negative or initiate and remain adherent to HIV treatment has to be set alongside broader structural challenges related to persistent sexuality-based discrimination, poverty, and spatial dislocation from MSM health providers. In other words, a key focus of urban health work in the Global South, namely the need to situate urban residents within frameworks that highlight the complexity of ways in which they approach and navigate health and health-seeking behavior in relation to wider structural factors, is easily elided or, quite frankly, ignored in current HIV programmatic work targeted at MSM. What we might therefore want to consider here, and a point I was making in one of the series of interventions from Peak Academics that's coming out in IIHS in the near future, is that urban scholarship has much to add to existing health programming work, which up until now has been pretty much devoid of an urban lens. There is, after all, no prohibition on urban scholars going into funding bids, such as those put forward by PEPFAR every few years in different parts of the world. But it's up to urban scholars to show their utility for such bids. In light of the less than stellar results from PEPFAR at achieving 90-90-90 targets among groups such as MSM, something I can go into more detail in the Q&A if you're interested. PEPFAR tend not to publish their failures, but I actually used to work with them on some of their projects, and they've pretty much failed to achieve 90-90-90 with MSM in many parts of the world. In light of these failures, it's possible to suggest that a key reason is that PEPFAR programming aimed at MSM in parts of sub-Saharan Africa has simply failed to conceptualize MSM as being anything more than simply recipients of health programming. The very focus, however, of urban health scholarship to consider the agency of communities rooted in and shaped by place-specific structural environments has the potential not only to expand the scope of research interests for Southern urbanists related to health, but also, if leveraged to support future PEPFAR funding programming and other HIV programming, has the very real potential to help save lives. Okay, so to conclude, what does all this mean? Well, hopefully in this talk, I've been able to show how in 3 interrelated examples, there are key ways in which Southern urban scholarship can engage more concretely with sexuality and with existing sexuality scholarship. As I started off by describing, there are in some key ways some already existing similarities in approach and also in terms of topic. However, what I've also hopefully demonstrated is that connecting together urban studies and the topic of sexuality may have additional, more instrumental benefits. As scholars such as Susan Parnell and Edgar Peterson have argued previously, specifically in the context of African urbanization, there is a certain degree of urgency and indeed instrumentality in the way urban research work needs to be conducted in light of the sheer scale of urbanization challenges and the very significant knowledge gaps that exist across urban sites. The need to think instrumentally might therefore also be important in the context of the 3 examples I've given here, and we can appreciate this in a number of ways. First, in the context of a relative lack of research on the very existence of same-sex communities and individuals existing in the informal sector in southern cities, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we find a situation where all the air in the room, so to speak, is being sucked up by big corporations such as Google, PwC, Accenture, and Deutsche Bank, for example, with regard to the relationship between cities and sexualities across the global south. Because these organizations are only focusing on the formal sector, there is not only the risk that individuals with same-sex desire, and especially gay men, are all stereotyped as wealthy, a common trope in certain sites in the global north. It also completely sidesteps the actual existence and needs of the majority of same-sex desiring individuals in the urban south. In short, not exploring the informal sector in relation to individuals with same-sex desire potentially gives over way too much space to the Accentures and Deutsche Banks of this world, organizations, one could perhaps fairly argue, whose mandates have rarely aligned with the political imperatives explicit within Southern urbanisms. Second, in the context of urban politics, a very great deal has already been written about the significant political struggles that gay activists are undertaking to overturn draconian laws and address wider sexuality-based stigma and discrimination. But the particular mechanics of this work as overtly urban have been largely overlooked. Rather, as I've written about elsewhere, a very great deal of research and also international funding support has emerged that is related overtly to national politics, often around a framework that draws on international human rights logics. Left to consider is the actual embedding of the actual local organizations that are doing this work in particular urban environments. As I mentioned earlier, virtually all these organizations across a region such as sub-Saharan Africa exist in primary and to a lesser extent, secondary cities. They are overtly urban, yet urban scholarship is yet to consider how they may well be connected to other forms of urban political action, both in terms of diverse solidarities with other urban social movements and groups who struggle against state sanction, and in the context of the diverse, more localized forms of political action that they may be engaging in at a local level, rather than simply in terms of a unidirectional confrontation, often at the level of the nation state. Considering such concerns may, however, be vital if we are both to get a better understanding of the struggles facing same-sex communities and the tactics they deploy in an attempt to overcome such struggles in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa. Third, and lastly, and perhaps most obviously, work on the HIV/AIDS pandemic in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa among groups defined by terms such as men who have sex with men highlights that a significant lacuna currently exists in the topics focused on by urban scholars working on health. While there are clear synergies with urban health work, especially as urban health work could consider MSM as subjects with embodied experiences who exist as active agents, as has occurred with other types of subjects in other urban environments. There currently is a dearth of research from urban scholars on the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and especially in the context of sexuality in urban Africa. This is both surprising and troubling. It's surprising considering the sheer quantum of funds and other resources which are currently being deployed to address such a severe pandemic. But it's also troubling in light of the particular skill set and perspectives that urban scholars bring to questions of health, skills that one could well argue are going to be necessary for HIV programs to be successful. It is simply insufficient to frame groups such as MSM as passive subjects who need to be incorporated into a 90-90-90 cascade, as they currently are. Urban scholars, simply put, have much to add to current approaches used to address the health and wider needs of groups such as MSM in a region such as sub-Saharan Africa. It is not, I would argue, hyperbolic to suggest that doing so may well help save lives. But what all this means, and to return again to the IIHS special issue, is that scholars need the time and space to be able to think through what these connections actually are, what new connections within urban studies or Southern urbanism may mean, and what implications they may have. And that has been one of the key benefits of the Peak Urban program, because it really gave scholars such as our team at the ACC and scholars at IIHS and other global partners across the South the opportunity to look what new connections may exist and what further avenues may be possible for researchers, and also what future funding pots may be possible to draw on. But just lastly to say, you know, a lot of this work has also been covered in the Peak Urban MOOC, which IIHS have been in charge of. And if you want to find out more about these topics, specifically in relation to sexuality and Southern urbanism, then I encourage you to look at the Peak Urban MOOC. But just to summarize, I think that there are potentially important ways in which Southern urban scholars can engage with questions of sexuality. The only question is if we do, how we do it, and how we may be instrumental about it. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andy. That was really, really interesting. I'd encourage folks to drop their questions in the Q&A box so that Andy can pick them up. And sort of while we wait, I actually wanted to ask you something myself. I think that the thing that I was actually really intrigued by is what you sort of spoke about right at the beginning of the talk, about the relationship between sexuality studies and sort of the spatializing of it in the context of the urban. And I was wondering if, particularly, in the way in which it's been done in the North, and I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that in the context of Southern cities a little bit more.
Thanks, Nihal. That's a great question. It's actually one of the key disjunctures that exists, and it's actually potentially possibly one of the reasons why there hasn't been more work on Southern urbanism in terms of sexuality. It's because the way in which the spatialization has been understood in the global North simply doesn't apply in the global South. So the traditional way in which that spatialization has been viewed has been through spatial agglomeration. So you end up getting, as Castell showed in the context of San Francisco and many subsequent studies in New York, London, lots of major metropolitan centers focused on, is the idea that you get, say, gay villages or gay communities in particular spaces. Now that requires a very particular type of heterosexual, homosexual, for lack of a better term, relationship, right? That there's a binary between space that is viewed as heteronormative and space that is viewed as not, and that you have sexual identities that are viewed as basically gay or straight or whatever the local terms are. And what we're seeing across the global South is that those categories simply don't work, partly because the very notion of a heterosexual homosexual binary, as the French philosopher Michel Foucault once put forward, is very parochial, right? It has a particular genealogy that comes from the 19th century Northwest Europe, and it doesn't apply in other contexts. So the types of way we need to approach space, the types of way that we engage with urban space in relation to sexuality, can't just cut and paste the foundational texts on sexuality and urban space from the global North into the global South, because what we're seeing in terms of those spaces aren't agglomeration. We're seeing forms of hustle, right? We're seeing forms of strategic negotiation. I kept coming back in the talk to this idea of strategic and pragmatic negotiation across a range of spaces. And that really speaks to understanding microgeographies as much as it does to understanding cities as a whole. So it requires really new theorization as much as it does an actual empirical gaze to want to see these groups.
Thanks, Andy. Folks, please do put your questions into the Q&A box, or actually, I think that's the only way you can ask questions, unless you can put it in the chat box as well. But yeah.
Perhaps I can just talk a bit more, if I've got the time, about why the US government's $90 billion investments into HIV programming is failing.
Yeah.
Because not many people know it and they don't publicize it. And I think it's really interesting on the one hand that urban scholarship hasn't engaged with this, right? And again, I think you could argue that's because urban scholarship from the South, as much as we like to talk about the South as not being tethered to the North, in the North, HIV/AIDS is seen as a manageable syndrome, right? It's seen as something that it's like diabetes. You can just deal with it. It's not seen as a global health catastrophe like it is in the South. And I don't think that urban South scholars have necessarily been given the space or the time to think through what HIV/AIDS means in the context of, say, the urban or in the context of sexuality. But what this also means, I think, is that there's been far less critical interrogation of groups like PEPFAR, who, the only people that interrogate them are the US Congress, who once every year have to re-up their budget, right? Community groups and academics don't really engage with them. And it's really fascinating to see that if you look at the 1990 cascade, that jumping off kind of bar chart, NGOs and local implementing partners of PEPFAR have been really successful at the first 90, which is getting people to test for HIV, which actually isn't that hard, right? All you need to do is put up a tent and a testing station next to a bus stop and people will test. The hard thing is getting people to initiate on treatment if they're positive and then stay adherent. And the reason for that is you need to engage with them as human beings. You need to engage with them as people that have got anxieties, fears, concerns, other things going on in their lives. Can they get to the clinic to pick up their medication? Are they going for repeated viral load tests? Why not? What are the barriers in the urban environment that stop that, right? They're all urban questions, right? And so PEPFAR's kind of failed on the second two 90s. And the reason for that is because they've not viewed these urban environments that they've been engaging as urban environments. They've been viewing them as just kind of flat Cartesian planes on which there are these needy subjects that if they just throw enough resources at them, they'll actually be helped. And that's not how the world works.
So just as a follow-up to that, actually, I wanted to ask if you could speak from sort of South Africa's experience with the COVID pandemic as well, and sort of the way in which sort of dealing with the HIV case helped with responses to COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting if you look at COVID, how on one level, how well South Africa did. I mean, it was pretty catastrophic. I mean, it wasn't Indian levels of badness, but it was pretty catastrophic in informal settlements, mainly because you can't social distance, as is the case in India. So, but what you did find in South Africa is that from a public health perspective, right, when it's simply about, can you test enough people? Can you create enough data? Then South Africa was brilliant, right? I mean, South Africa identified, I think it was 2 of the variants first, right? Simply because its monitoring and surveillance capabilities, because of its history with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, have been so advanced. UCT, the university I'm based at, I think is rated 3rd globally in terms of HIV/AIDS research. And that was all that resource was redirected towards COVID, right? But again, the challenge is that a lot of that was kind of in a triage mentality. It was like, this is a crisis. We just need to get data. We need to do, like, the social ramifications of that, the human implications of that, the fact that in somewhere like Cape Town, they took the homeless and moved them basically into a concentration camp and thought that that was okay, right? In the context of South Africa's legacy of apartheid and spatial segregation. The fact that, urban health scholars weren't jumping up and down and saying, my God, you're not only creating disease risk because you're forcing these groups together, but it's also, an affront to their own human rights that you're doing that, right? Again, it's the urban question that is missing in these particular moments.
We do have a question actually on methodological approaches to look into the relation in the global South, given particularly, and this was something I would have asked shortly, given the stigma and structural exclusion of queer communities.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. At the moment, and this is another plug, I'm just doing lots of plugs. I've plugged the IIHS special issue. I'm now going to plug a special issue that I'm guest editing in Urban Forum, where we're kind of looking at this question. Over the past few years, very recently, like over the past 2-3 years, the title of the special issue is African Urban Sexualities, right? So it's actually trying to get at the root of what I've been describing in this talk is what's been lacking, right? So the special issue is specifically looking at examples as to how you can take that forward and how certain scholars are taking it forward. There's people like B. Kaminga, Eddie Abangi, Neil Hassan, who I've worked with previously on the Peak project, John Marnell, Mark Gavissa, who I mentioned earlier in terms of the pink line. These are all scholars that are working with these communities. And it's really hard to work with them because they are marginalized, right? And because they are sometimes invisible, and because them talking to you as a researcher can potentially place them at physical harm, right? So as with other groups where that has been the case, right, the need is always that you have to go into these communities very generously. All the ethical concerns that you would have generally doing research needs to get ramped up to 11. And you need to be very generous in the way that you try and engage and accommodate these particular subjects. Generally, the methodologies need to be qualitative, ethnographic, long-term participant observation. Public health officials have gone in the exact opposite direction, right? And just to give an example, many studies funded by groups like Johns Hopkins University have done these large-scale quantitative surveys of groups such as MSM, and they get published in, you know, really high-ranking journals like AIDS and Behavior, AIDS Care, and things like this. And they're good in the sense that they tell you what the HIV prevalence rate is of these communities, but they're absolutely terrible in telling you how you address those needs, right? Because all they are quantitative, descriptive stats of communities which, by the way, it's debatable whether they are actually MSM or not, right? Because there's a huge ethical thing around you have to pay participants for taking part in studies. And in resource constrained settings, say, okay, yeah, I'm an MSM, give me my 100 Rand or my whatever it is. The validity of some of this data, I'm not calling into question the scholarship or the integrity of other academics, but I am saying this from the perspective of someone that has also done quantitative studies exactly on these topics, and also had, been first author on papers that have been in AIDS care and in AIDS behavior. The validity of that data, I think, is significantly less than the validity of data you get through ethnography, participant observation, long-term engagement with these communities. The only reason why you need to do those large-scale quantitative surveys is because PEPFAR want them. And why do PEPFAR want them? Because they want to plug them into the 90-90-90 cascade. And that actually gets you nowhere. So the answer is be careful, be empathetic, obviously, and be highly ethically attuned. And work that is going on, for example, Eddie Abangi's work in Nairobi in Kenya, which is really looking at these microgeographies, is a brilliant example of how to do that type of work.
Actually, just to add to that, Andy, I wanted to, sort of also mention, and this is something again that I, especially when you're talking about the first kind of round of, the first case that you talked about around the informal economy, was to think a little bit also about how when you're doing this kind of research, and it intersects not only with informality and sort of the legality, illegality question, but also other kinds of identity, right, which might potentially lead to greater risk or sort of even further challenges in accessing resources, support. And I was wondering if in the case of South Africa, I mean, in the case of India, I can think of immediately sort of religion and caste that would play a very strong role. But I was wondering if across the work that you've done across Sub-Saharan Africa, how other forms of identity and identity politics actually affects sexuality studies, and in the urban particularly.
That's really fascinating. That's a brilliant question, Nihar. And there's two ways to answer it. The first is to again plug Mark Gavissa's book, The Pink Line. Basically, if you haven't read Mark's book, it's going to be known in the next few years as like one of those watershed books. It's going to be like a cornerstone book in terms of the field of sexuality studies, but actually also urban studies, because it's basically an urban ethnography of a range of different sites globally. And some of the sites that he looks at are in India, and he looks at the religion and the caste question in relation to sexuality and the particular ways in which particular religious practices create opportunities and spaces for certain types of same-sex sexual activity, but also close down other opportunities. I think that that's also the case in African examples, but there I think that the religious question is based around Christian fundamentalism. and particularly the challenge that's created in places like Uganda, where the un-African argument about same-sex sexuality has been conflated with the ungodly argument about same-sex sexuality. So I think that religion is a key one. The other one that I think comes across a lot is the idea that anyone who talks about same-sex sexuality has been colonized, right? So if you come out as a gay man, if you use that terminology, right, in somewhere like Uganda or Kenya, then you have been brainwashed by the West in some way, or you're trying to get funding from the West in some way, or you've been abused by someone in the West, right? So the agency of individuals to self-describe in these terms is negated by those who are against same-sex groups because they see it as a form of neocolonialism. And that's another key challenge that is overlaid with the religious argument, which becomes also very challenging. And in fact, it's got so bad in Uganda. And again, I think this also speaks, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but you know, these struggles for gay rights on the African continent have been going on now for about 10 or 15 years. And they've been overwhelmingly using the human rights framework to do so at a state level, right? Gay rights are human rights, end of argument, right? Now, they've been doing it for 10 or 15 years, and it's not really been working. And we know this, for example, because the main NGO in Kampala, which has been spearheading this stuff in Uganda, 15 years later has now just been made illegal, right? Now, right? Not 15 years ago, now, right? And that, I think, also speaks to the failure of only looking at these types of politics at the state level, right? There's other stuff going on as to why Sexual Minorities Uganda, that's the NGO, has at this point been made illegal. And I would suggest that some of that is to do with the urban dynamics going on in Kampala and the political dynamics going on within Kampala, right? And we're not seeing that. We're focusing overtly at this kind of geopolitical level. And I think that that's a detriment to the reality of the hustle and the struggle that is going on in these places.
I think there's a question, just clarifying the book that you mentioned, The Pink Line.
Oh, yeah. So the book I was referring to, let me just bring up my slides again, is this one. Can everyone see that? Mark Govissa is a very famous journalist. He's won multiple awards. He wrote the biography of the previous president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. He's a phenomenal scholar. To write this book, he got an Open Society 2-year fellowship, which basically bought him out for 2 years. And all he did for 2 years was fly around the world, getting to know queer groups in Ann Arbor in Michigan, in refugee camps in Nairobi, in townships in Cape Town, in India, in Mexico, in I think Poland, in Russia. And it was just all about the similarities in terms of the ways in which these communities try and make do, right? Overwhelmingly in cities. And yeah, it's leagues ahead of where the current academic debates are.
I find it interesting that Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was for a long time, is among sort of the world's queer frontiers. But if there aren't any further questions, I'd like to end by thanking Andy very, very much. We've been trying to get him to IIHS for a while, and I'm glad we were finally able to. So thank you, Andy, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon. And thank you all.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity. And please check out the IJR series of interventions, which Nihar, Michael Keith, Sue Parnell, Wanduke Carlos, and myself writing more about why we need to create space to think about these other ways of looking at urbanism. Thanks, Andy. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Andrew and Neha, for being part of this talk. For more updates such as this, Please follow us on social media at research at IIHS. Thank you and good night.
Thanks. Bye.